Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, dear participants. And thank you, everyone, for joining. A warm welcome to the webinar on Achieving Gender Equality through Diversity and Inclusion in the 21st Century Workplace. And this webinar is organized by the We Empower G7 program team. And our exciting program, We Empower G7, is funded by the European Union and implemented by UN Women and the International Labour Organization. This is Meral Guzel here from UN Women, and I am the Women's Empowerment Principal Specialist, and I will be moderating today. First, I would like us to go through our agenda. Sorry, before going to the agenda, if you have any question during the webinar, please enter your questions in the questions pane in the box. You can write for the organizer or for the panelists to answer. And we will just choose those questions and we will be able to answer you at the end of our webinar. First, I'd like to go through our agenda. The opening remarks will be given by Tim Rivera, and he is the program officer for the EU delegation to the United States. Then we will have Robert Baker from Mercer, who will present the general landscape of gender equality and diversity and inclusion in the future of work. Our second presenter is Rohini Anand from Sodexo. She will discuss Sodexo's initiatives in this area as a private sector company. And we will have a Q&A section, and that will be around 20 minutes. So we really try to give enough time to interact with the presenters. Please send me again your question in the panelist box. So if you have this question, please enter the question in the pane for the organizer and panelists separately. Now, on behalf of the We Empower team, I would like to invite dear Tim Rivera, Programs Officer for the EU delegation to the United States, to share his welcoming remarks. And Tim, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Meral, and thank you to all of you for joining this webinar today. As Meral said, my name is Tim Rivera, and I'm a Programs Officer with the European Union. Also, as Meral said, this webinar is part of the We Empower initiative, which is an EU-funded project implemented by UN Women together with the International Labour Organization to support women's economic empowerment in 7 countries. That would be the US, Canada, Japan, and the 28 countries of the European Union. We are working at G7 level and with UN Women for really 2 reasons. The first is because fundamentally the EU believes in taking a multilateral approach to solving global problems like gender inequality. But secondly, because our countries together, the countries of the G7, represent such a significant percentage of the global economy, together we can really drive change that ripples even further across the world through supply chains. So the We Empower project has 2 primary components. The first supports multi-stakeholder dialogues, not unlike this particular webinar, to share best practices and further policy efforts and private sector initiatives that will improve women's economic empowerment across all G7 countries. The second component will grow and strengthen the UN women's empowerment principles, which Meral works on. And that's a framework that is designed to really help private sector companies achieve real gender equality in their workplaces, including the development of a reporting and benchmarking system to ensure transparency and accountability amongst all of the signatories to the principles. But this webinar on diversity and inclusion really sits squarely in the middle of one of the project's priorities, especially here in the United States where I'm based, which is the future of work. It also sort of sits squarely at the heart of the EU itself, because our motto is united in diversity. So these issues of diversity, inclusion, and equality are really at the core of what we do and who we are. But the EU's approach to achieving gender equality in the economic sphere includes several areas of focus that all, in their own way, relate to questions of diversity and inclusion. Firstly, increasing women's participation in the labor market and ensuring their economic independence vis-a-vis men. Secondly, reducing and ultimately eliminating the gender pay gap, the earnings gap, and pension gap that exists between men and women. And lastly, ensuring the promotion of equality in decision making. I'm sure both of our panelists will get into a bit of that in their presentations. But I'd like to share a couple of key points that emerged in the most recent annual report on equality between women and men in the European Union that I think may be of interest or of relevance for this webinar today. Firstly, while the EU reached its highest ever level of women's employment in 2017, the gender employment gap remains around 11.5%. So that has stayed sort of quite persistent. So there's still progress that needs to be made there. But ultimately, the EU hopes to, through better work-life balance and provision of parental leave, among other initiatives, really move from a dual breadwinner model to one in which parents can be both earners and caregivers. This requires flexibility from employers and for men to use that flexibility to do more care work rather than necessarily improving their working performance. But unfortunately, progress in achieving women's inclusion on company boards in the European Union has stalled a bit since 2015. The EU made a really strong push on this starting in 2012, but as of October 2018, the proportion of women on the boards of the largest publicly listed companies registered in EU member states was 26.7%. So there is still a long way to go to reach proper equality there. But we have noticed that there is evidence that quotas for women on boards do drive more rapid progress than some softer measures. But our distinguished panelists today, Rohini and Rob, will have more to say on the business case for diversity and inclusion and some concrete steps that companies can take. But ultimately, it's my hope that the future of work will include more women working and innovating right alongside men across all industries to make sure that these new innovations really do serve everyone. Diversity is about ensuring that everyone is heard. And that fundamentally requires changing the culture within organizations and across the workforce. A true commitment to a diverse and inclusive workplace, it involves adopting different policies, sure, but it also requires a thoughtful and deliberate effort is made to adopt and implement a series of strategies that really transform workplace culture that in such a way that it embraces inclusion and does so in a sustainable way. But I will leave you now with my final thought, which is to share a saying that I encountered a few days ago, which struck me. If diversity is having a seat at the table and inclusion is having a voice at the table, then belonging is having that voice actually be heard. So with that parting thought, I will hand the mic back to Meral. Thank you once again for participating on this webinar. Thank you very much to Robert and to Rohini for your valuable contributions. And I wish you all a good meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your inspiring remarks. And I certainly love your quote, and I will not forget it. It's fundamental for women to sit at the table and to speak at the table, and that her voice is actually heard. And I think we can also agree that diversity and inclusion should be at the core business units within all companies and businesses. Our first presenter is Robert Baker. He is the senior partner and leader of diversity and inclusion consulting for the international region of Mercer. He is based in London, but he is part of the global team. And with his colleagues, they help organizations to build the diverse and inclusive cultures, workplaces, and workforces they need to meet the key business challenges of disruption, innovation, and growth. I should also add that Rob has spent 8 years on the board of PWN, and which is a global PWN Global, which is a leading global women's network, and most recently he acted as a co-president. Over to you, Robert.
much. And I just wanted to check, can you hear me okay?
Now, yes, thank you.
Super, okay. Well, thanks, Meral. Thanks, Tim. It's fabulous to see the work that the EU has sponsored in this space. And hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you on this webinar about achieving gender equality through diversity and inclusion in the 21st century workplace. And what we want to talk about really on this webinar is about how companies can build or improve their diversity and inclusion strategy so that they can achieve gender equality and prepare to really face these challenges and actually exploit the opportunities in the 21st century workplace and in the future of work. So I'm going to cover basically three key topics. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how the world of work is changing and the opportunities and the challenges that creates specifically for women. And I'm sure some of this background will be familiar to many of you. But then I want to talk about why diversity and inclusion is so critical for organizations to succeed, how it drives business growth, and in particular want to focus on diversity and inclusion in helping us achieve gender equality. Now, obviously, diversity and inclusion covers a wide variety of elements, and we talk about gender, we talk about ethnicity, age, ability, disability, maybe thinking styles, etc. We're obviously focusing today on gender. It's the biggest proportion, obviously, of the elements that we need to address. But the really interesting thing here is that gender's about men as well. And that's why I'm delighted as a man to be very active in this space, because I think what's good for women is also going to be good for men. And I think, if we could achieve equality for women in this space, I think the men will benefit too, will be liberated from the kind of stereotypes that we end up facing in the workplace. So we heard earlier that we want to be, and I think the UN stands for certainly being planet 50-50 by 2030. Well, as we heard, we're some way off that, and we need to step it up. So how do we accelerate that progress? I'm going to be talking about the gender equality urgency that we need to have here, because it's a problem we need to, and it's a challenge we need to really get working on. Obviously, Rohini is going to talk about what Sodexo have been doing in this space, which is a fabulous job. So I'm going to try and set the landscape for that. Now, the slide that Meral's advanced to here is me with my the Women's Network that I'm was co-president of, and you see a yellow flashing arrow. I don't know you really needed that to see where I was in the middle of it all, but this has been the most amazing development opportunity for me to really learn the challenges for women in the workplace and kind of how we can work together to solve those. And I would certainly encourage any man on the call to get involved with women's networks. And actually, we've now become a gender balance network at PWN because we want to engage men. And indeed, that was my first role with the network, to get other men engaged in gender equality and really sort of help move forward in advancing women in work through that. So that's my passion, if you like, the passion that I've brought to this. But also in my day job at Mercer as the leader of diversity and inclusion consulting, I'm having a lot of conversations with senior leaders, CEOs, CHROs about why their businesses should be focusing on building diverse and inclusive workforces, why it's so business critical that they should be doing that, and also they should be focusing on promoting gender equality. So I'm going to bring both of those lenses to the conversation this afternoon. So moving ahead, I'm going to quickly move through onto the next slide, the way that the business world is transforming. And none of you will be surprised to know that what we're seeing here is massive disruption in the world of work. Mercer's Talent Trends survey showed that 73% of executives are expecting significant disruption in their industry in the next 3 years. And they're also expecting that automation is going to replace 1 in 5 of their current jobs. Now, we also know, of course, that the World Economic Forum is expecting that AI and automation will actually create net new jobs as well, apparently 58 million by 2022. So there's a lot of change and challenge going on in here, and companies need to really be thinking about their talent strategies to take advantage of this. But just to take one example from this landscape here, for example, Airbnb on the top right. I don't know how many of you have used Airbnb, but that's now a company worth more than $30 billion. In 11 years, they've moved to having 6 million properties, more than the top 5 hotel chains combined. And that's just the way an industry can be disrupted. That's the way that so many organizations now are looking at what is changing in the world. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that it's really transforming the world of talent demand. So Meral, if we move on, please change slides. Yeah, to talent demand, yeah. And what you're seeing, as I mentioned, is this digital revolution where we need humans to be taking on these roles that require more judgment and higher cognitive capabilities to work alongside the technology, the machines, the robots, etc. We're also seeing companies wanting to be more agile because everything is changing so much more quickly. And therefore, they're needing new sources of talent, a more flexible workforce, which actually potentially is playing into the opportunities that creates for more diverse talent. And then, of course, the rise of the sharing economy. I've shown 15% of European workers as being independent here. In the US, it's closer to 40%. So there's a whole change in the way that organizations are working, that the talent is coming through into the workplace. And looking at the next slide, you'll see on the talent supply side, again, no surprises here. We know that millennials will next year be over 50% of the workforce, and Gen Z coming through. What we see is more demand for workplace flexibility. They want organizations to be aligned with their own personal values. So they want the company to be standing for something good in the world. And that's creating real challenges for companies in certain sectors. For example, in the energy sector or banking sector, how do they come across as an organization that is really trying to do good in the world? And that's the kind of challenge in terms of employee attraction there. At the same time, we've got an aging society. We have older workers who need to be retained, actually, because we can't afford to let them go, but they also need to be upskilled. So we have this growing multi-generational workforce. And then when you combine that with talent migration, where we're seeing more workers being prepared to relocate, we're seeing a multicultural workforce as well. So really, moving on to the next slide, it's just a picture, really, of what the workforce needs to look like. It's basically multicultural, it's multi-generational, it's diverse in so many different ways. Personally, as an older man, I'm very happy to see there's an older man in the background in that picture. Hopefully we're still around contributing to the workforce. But what it means is companies are really needing to focus now on what do we need to do to attract each of these kind of different groups of talent into our workplace. How do we create an employee value proposition for them? So that's the world of work and the way the world of work is changing. And now let's look at really what's happening as far as diversity and inclusion and gender diversity and really the opportunities for women in the workplace. So moving ahead onto the next slide, we're seeing that really already, and Rohini is going to cover this, and I'm not going to touch on this for very long, but the business case, I believe, for diversity and inclusion has been made. So many conversations I have with company leaders really, they get this point that more inclusive organizations do better. And, as it says there, and the PwC survey, 85% of CEOs think that diversity and inclusion enhances performance. So I'm not going to dwell on that further, but on the next slide, what I see in particular is the discussions that I have with leaders around the case for gender diversity. And this represents the kind of conversations that I'm having with CEOs and CHROs about, why gender diversity is good for their business. And there are 4 key areas that they end up really agreeing to where it's so important. One is in leadership, to get more diverse thinking. So if you have just a group of similar people around the table, you're going to get potentially groupthink. And so by bringing more women into leadership teams, you're getting more diverse thinking, you're getting better decisions. And of course, as Christine Lagarde, I think, famously said, had it been Lehman sisters rather than Lehman brothers, we may have had a different outcome to the financial crisis. Well, who knows? But it's just raising that point, really, that we need that different kind of thinking. And I think, CEOs and business leaders are starting to get that. They also need to attract talent to drive innovation and the future growth. And what they realize is that that's increasingly needs to be diverse talent, and that women can play a huge part here. I'm very pleased to say, for example, at Mercer, the leaders of our innovation teams are women. And you really see in working with them just how they come at this completely differently and inject these, kind of fabulously different ideas. And of course, customers. A lot of companies now realize that they cannot carry on in the future, not really recognizing how their customer base is changing, and the power of women in the consumer marketplace, whether it's sort of 80% of consumer decisions now being controlled or being impacted by the choice of women, and dare I say, even in sectors you might have thought of as being male dominated, such as purchase of automobiles, for example, women have a very, very strong voice there. So any company that doesn't acknowledge the role of women in its customer base is really asking for trouble. And then finally, on the investor's point of view, this is a number taken from a Credit Suisse survey, which shows that companies that really have women at the top of their organization and have a gender balance strategy perform better in business terms, and actually investors get a 3.5% per annum better return. So investors are really looking at now, so where do we find these companies with more gender balance? And I'm delighted to see, for example, that the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index has been set up, because it's now showcasing firms that have a strong commitment to gender equality. And as Michael Bloomberg said, gender equality is smart business. So in the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index, they're focusing on 230 global companies where 26% of the women are in senior leadership positions. So we're really starting to see some change coming through here. And of course, if you're a bank, the regulators are now also getting interested. They're looking at the balance that you have on your board and your management. They're looking to try and avoid what they call, high risk-taking cultures. So for a variety of different reasons, this business case now for gender diversity has never been stronger. So if the case for gender diversity is so strong, kind of where are we now, and why are we not where we want to be? So going on to the next slide. I'm sure you can probably tell me that the 202 years here is the number of years that the World Economic Forum says it's going to take until we reach financial gender parity. And as we talked earlier, kind of the UN wants to see a planet 50-50 by 2030. Well, it might take quite a bit longer for us to get to gender equality at the current pace if we don't step up and if we don't accelerate the pace of change. So that's what we want to focus on. And yet at the same time, next slide, what we're also seeing is this world being disruptive. And I mentioned earlier the changing nature of work, changing technology, the changing workforce. Actually, that's potentially making it harder for women at work. It presents opportunities, but there are also some challenges too. And I want to quickly talk through those. So moving ahead onto the next slide, what we'll see is here that these are the major trends. Meral, if we can just move one slide forward. Yeah. These are the trends that are really, sorry, back one. These are the trends that are shaping the future as far as the workplace is concerned, and they have major implications for gender equality. And I won't go through all of them now. I will be sharing the slides later so you can have a look at those in more detail. But basically, it's thinking through how we're designing jobs and what workforce composition do we need for the future? How do we upskill our workers? How do we change the culture so that diverse employees feel that they fit in, feel that they belong, to use the words that Tim mentioned there? And how do we manage that diverse talent? We certainly need new kinds of leadership. And that's one of the things that's coming through loud and clear. The talent of today wants a different kind of leadership, one that's got more emotional intelligence and one that's got more, kind of rounder thinking about what good management and good performance looks like. And then there's obviously transforming the organization and the talent model. All of those steps are absolutely key to be taken, but they need to be thought through very clearly for the impact that they're going to have on gender equality. And as I mentioned, there are opportunities here too. Particularly, for example, in that area of leadership and leadership competencies, where I think women, have got a fantastic opportunity to be more of the leaders of the future. But if we have one big concern on the next slide, it's that really the jobs that are growing at the quickest rates have the lowest representation of women. So computer and maths, management, architecture and engineering, those are growing the fastest. But they had the lowest proportions of women, 23%, 25%, 11%. So when I did a careers evening at an all-girls school last year, I said, hey, your daughters, and you should be encouraging them to go into computer and math, management and architecture and engineering, because that's where there's going to be shortages. That's where they're going to be in so much demand. And of course, what we see also is those office and administration jobs where 54% of them are held by women. Those are at risk. And so we've really got to think through, how we're managing this change of the workforce. So next slide. So where we are now then is this is a representation taken from Mercer's When Women Thrive study. And this is the average global organization from all the different submissions we've had around the world on this. And what we see is in companies at the support staff level, we're starting roughly 50-50. But by the time we get to the top at the executive level, it's gone down to 20% women and it's 80% men. And despite the promotions and the hires that we're trying to do, you can see, for example, at the executive level, we're trying to hire women at a faster rate than men. the challenge is they're also leaving at a faster rate than men. So this data is absolutely critical to showing the challenge that we have now, and of course it means that we can really start to think through, what we need to do to unblock that. So the next slide, really just to come to a conclusion on this, is that there are 4 key trends that we're seeing currently, and these are the trends that we need to work against, if you like, to really build the workforce of the future. So currently what we're seeing is hiring, promotion, retention rates aren't sufficient to generate gender equality anytime soon. So we've got to change the approach there. Organizations aren't building future pipelines of female talent, and again, we've got to do more work there. And when we do build the pipeline, we're seeing that women exit at faster rates or higher rates. So again, we've got to address those challenges. And we've also got to support the hiring and promotion of women into executive ranks through practices, whether that's kind of flexible working or other practices around parental leave or whatever it is that they need support with. Those are the areas that really need to be worked on. So what can companies do about this? So on the next slide, we just show very in summary form, if you like, a framework around what companies can do. And this is a framework we find companies really value from. It's about aligning on the business imperative. So why is it so important? And then it's looking at their data and routing their strategy and proof. And one of the things that we're talking about here in gender equality is to benchmark yourself against organizations in your industry and beyond to see how you're doing and stacking up. And Mercer has a partnership with Edge Foundation based in Zug, which is a global certification. And we've been delighted to work with Edge Foundation because it really enables companies to see and make really visible their support for gender equality, and it gives them a significant advantage in attracting female and retaining female talent by being certified through the Edge process. But it's also about engagement of leaders, passionate leaders. And I'm really delighted to say, for example, that we see at Mercer, Martine Furland as our global CEO. She's really showing her active commitment. She's really being part of the solution to this, and we're seeing other female leaders at Mercer do that too. And then it's about taking action, whether it's flexible working, parental leave, and then of course, very importantly, it's measuring the results and really creating an environment where we can persevere. This change is not going to happen, in a very, very short time. It's going to take a while, but of course, if we don't get working on this, it's not going to change as quickly as we need to. And then on the next slide, looking at individuals, what you as an individual can do is really in 2 areas. At work, understand and be part of the diversity and inclusion strategy. If you're a man or a woman, actively lead to advance women at work and have a compelling point of view about why this matters. People are looking to you as a leader to have a view about why this is so important. And then as an individual, you should listen and engage. I think, listen to also counterpoint of views, because sometimes those disengaged people are the ones we really need to really get on board, and be passionate about driving change. And I think for women in particular, be your own advocate. I think men have learned for years how to be their own advocates. And what we're seeing now, I think, is women becoming more of their own advocates, which is a fantastically welcome, change that we're seeing. So be a disruptor, basically, because we're all in this together. And we need to work together to accelerate progress. That's going to be great for women. They're going to achieve more progress, but I think also it's going to liberate men and all genders, basically, to be able to achieve that progress we need to see in the workplace. So, Meral, I'm going to pass back to you, as I think we now need to go to Rohini.
Thank you so much, Rob, for giving us this important overview and on the future of work and the business case, especially business case for why companies need to focus on diversity and inclusion to achieve gender equality. And thank you very much also for giving us both lenses, because in most of the times, diversity and inclusion and gender discussions, they are discussed separately. However, you presented beautifully that diversity and inclusion and gender equality is the future of work. And our second speaker is Rohini Anand, and I don't know if we have to really present her. She's a very well-known pioneer, and I would take the words of Rob, disruptor in the area of gender equality and diversity and inclusion. She is the Senior Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Global Chief Diversity Officer of Sodexo. And she's responsible for the strategic direction, implementation, an alignment of Sodexo's integrated global diversity and inclusion initiatives, as well as Sodexo's corporate social responsibility and wellness strategies. And over to you, Rohini.
Thank you, Meral. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So thank you, and thanks to Rob as well. I'm really delighted to be on this webinar. And to follow up on what Rob shared, I'm going to share very briefly, building on his business case, a little bit more on the business case. I totally agree, and I sort of feel like we've done enough on the business case and that leaders get it. But in our case, it really is about engaging the entire organization. And sometimes you have to take different approaches to do that. And then I'm going to share about how Sodexo has advanced gender equality in a very large organization. So if you go to the next slide, this really just demonstrates to you how large we are. We're in 72 countries. We're the 19th largest employer in the world, 460,000 employees in over 40 locations. And what's challenging here is how do you bring about culture change in such a geographically dispersed organization? You know, we work out of client sites. We provide food and facilities management services. And if the values with the clients align, that's wonderful. But if the values don't align, it can be a challenge. But it's also an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for us to really impact and broaden our footprint and to impact the clients as well. So if you go to the next slide, what I would share with you, sort of the headline about our storyline. You know, today we are seen as a leader in diversity and inclusion. We've had over 15 years of programming. We're on the Diversity Inc. Hall of Fame, have won the Catalyst Award. More importantly, however, our culture has changed. It's transformed. And our inclusive culture really powers our people. You know, when we look at our engagement scores that's done by an external third party, and we do it every 2 years, diversity and inclusion is one of the 2 highest drivers of engagement for both men and women. And then lastly, it drives our business growth. We see that gender balance management teams consistently produce higher sales and profitability. And for us, diversity and inclusion is a competitive differentiator. So it's been quite a journey. But I will say, you know, to those of you that are at different places in your journey, that we certainly didn't start here. It's taken a lot of intentionality. It's taken leadership. It's taken a lot of work to get us to where we are. And I'll share with you how we've done that. But first, very briefly on the next slide, building on the business case that Rob talked about and really honing in on the gender balanced business case. If you go to the next slide, please. For us at Sodexo, the business case is very clear. It's about the talent. We want to get and keep the best talent. So it's about recruiting, but as Rob mentioned, it's also about retention. And we want to create that inclusive culture where all of our employees can be optimally productive. It's about really providing culturally competent services to our customers. And then for our clients, it's about, you know, in making sure that diversity and inclusion is a differentiator and a competitive advantage. And then ultimately, we really, for us, it's really important to improve the quality of life for all those that we serve. So it's about improving the quality of life for women in the community as well. So you can see here some data points as business case for gender. You know, we know that more women than men are graduating from colleges, 150 degrees for women for every 100 for men. We also know that diversity really leads to more innovation. We know that this is the Goldman Sachs study that narrowing the gender gap could push income per capita in emerging markets by up to 14% by 2020. And then we know also that the potential for women is really highly underutilized. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that women clearly represent, it's an underutilized pool of talent, represent a talent pool that we can leverage. The graduation rates are high, the purchasing power is high, and with the forecasted talent shortages in the next 20 years, a McKinsey study in 2016 really highlighted that the shortage of skilled workers that's projected to be 30 million by 2020. If we had an equal employment rate for women, we could almost completely close that gap. So there's definitely a talent argument there. There's also a productivity and innovation argument, as well as a financial argument. So if you go to the next slide, you know, you can see that companies with below average diversity scores had lower revenues than companies with above average diversity scores. And then building on that, a McKinsey study looked at data in 2014 on the next slide and 2017 and found that those companies with balanced leadership, gender balanced leadership in management ranks and leadership, and particularly outperform those with fewer numbers of women in leadership. So the likelihood of financial performance, and this shows the results in 2014 and 2017, you can see there's a gap between the first quartile, those with greater representation of women in leadership, than those in the fourth quartile. And similarly, there's a gap in the 2017 study. These are the percentages above the national industry median. There have been several studies on the next slide that show that companies with high representation of women in top management experience better financial results, and you can see those here. Now, we decided at Sodexo, if you go to the next slide, to do our own study. Why did we do that? Next slide, please. Because yes, we have all these studies that demonstrate the link between representation of women in leadership and better financial performance. But we needed to do something that really honed in on our own data and needed to study our data. So we did this study, and we now have 5 years of data that basically demonstrates that gender balanced teams have better financial outcomes, and they're predictable and sustainable. So the reason we did this was to get buy-in for our rank and file. Yes, leadership may have bought in, but we had, managers around the world, 72 countries, 460,000 employees, who basically said, well, these are sort of studies by Credit Suisse and McKinsey, but we're not so sure about our own data. So we set about doing the study, and our study is a little different from the others because we look at management in the pipeline. So we look across all management, not just leadership, because for us, that's the talent pipeline that we want to be focusing on. We also look at financial and non-financial data. We put a stake in the ground, which was 40 to 60% is how we define gender balanced teams. And it really was about a study for us, internal study to help to get buy-in. So if you go to the next slide, we held our breath and did this study, but the results were pretty compelling. What we found was that teams with 40 to 60% women outperform those teams with less than 40% women on each of these 5 key performance indicators: operating margin, employee retention, client retention, safety, and employee engagement. Very compelling results. But what we also found was that teams with more than 60% women, the results stagnate. So it's not about any one gender being better than the other, but it is about that balance to get that optimal creativity, innovation, productivity, and to really sort of shape and change the culture. So what did we do? So if we look at sort of next slide, shaping and changing the culture, for us, it really is about sort of systemic culture change. It's about engaging the whole ecosystem. And we needed to engage top down, bottom up, and middle out. So I'll focus on a couple of things. First was commitment from the top, absolutely critical. Strong business case, which you saw. Third is a clearly articulated strategy with clear governance. And then measurement and accountability. And I think these were sort of critical to our success. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a bit about sort of the governance structure and the strategy. Next slide, please. So together is our governance structure that really drives gender equity across the organization. You can see that it's made up of, the entire board is made up of 41 members. This includes alumni members, active members, and the 22 range from 20 nationalities. And the objectives are, we basically said, based on our own data, our own research, that we want to reach 40% women in our senior leaders by 2025. We're currently at 33%. And we said that we want to make sure, so this was a bold objective that the CEO stated. And that objective is linked to incentives. So 10% of our senior leaders' bonuses are linked to that objective. When we started off, Tim talked about sort of quotas. I see this more as aspirational targets, but what gets measured gets done. And unless you have put a stake in the ground, you're not going to make progress, just like anything else in business. We also want to increase the number of women in the talent pipeline, so get to that 40 to 60% range at all levels. Increase gender balance in management teams. increase the number of women in our operational roles with P&L responsibility, because we know from several studies, including Catalyst, that women have to have P&L responsibilities, operational responsibilities, in order to advance in an organization. And then lastly, to foster a culture of inclusion. So we didn't start here. There was a lot of resistance. I remember when we first had the meeting with the So Together group, women basically didn't want to be part of it, and they only came because the CEO invited them. And the question in their mind was, I am in my role not because I'm a woman, but because I'm good at what I do. And they wanted to distance themselves. So it took about 2 years, these were the senior most women, to get them on board before we started really driving this across the organization. Today, I'm very proud to say 56% of our board is women, and we have a female chair of the board, 33% of our group senior leaders, and 36% of the executive committee. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that this governance body, So Together, the mission is basically to drive impactful actions, to engage the organization, and lastly, to make women visible. So we very carefully select women who will be part of this group. And it is, by the way, both men and women that belong to this. Initially, it was just women, but then we expanded it to have male ambassadors as well that really drive this in their spheres of influence. So if you go to the next slide, let's just talk about 5 key areas where they're focused. The first is around HR processes, and they have put in place sort of gender balanced candidate slates. They also look at pay equity issues with HR, really drive flexibility across the organization. And we have found that women under 30 are perhaps the least engaged in our organization. So we're trying to unpack the reasons for that and put in place initiatives. Gender networks, we have about 20 networks across the world. And the role of this group is to connect them, to bring them together on an annual basis. Leadership development is tremendous. We have a global virtual leadership development program sponsored by So Together. And we have, they go through this program, and then we have mentoring circles, and they also sponsor women across the organization. And sponsorship, and maybe if there's a question on that, I can talk about that, Meral, has been very, very effective. And I'll talk about sort of how we did that and maybe, share a story about the impact. But today, it's very successful. And then empowering women in the communities, we focus on violence against women, empowering women economically in the supply chain, and our She Works initiative, which is a job shadowing program. Communication, International Women's Day, we have 80 plus locations that have participated, and then our She Works program. So the results have been great. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a summary of some of the results here. The key drivers have been, strong business case, leadership, from the top. So the So Together group has 2 executive sponsors that sit on the global executive committee, clear metrics and accountability. So we have, the 40% target, we have the linkage to 10% bonuses, and then a strong governance structure and, sort of strategy, which is top down, bottom up, and middle out. And lastly, I will say that, we have been engaging across our entities and countries to sign the Women's Empowerment Principles. And we so far have 35 countries that have signed. On the next slide. So we're extremely proud of that, because it does help to sort of galvanize the organizations and make some progress there. So let me stop there, and perhaps if there are questions, I can sort of talk a little bit more about some of the challenges and successes. Thank you, Meral.
Thank you very much, Rohini, and for giving us a view of Sodexo, how Sodexo is approaching diversity and inclusion. And certainly the systematic culture change from top down, middle out, bottom up, they are all critical for success. And I also want to add that Sodexo, as Rohini explained, made a call to all their affiliates globally to sign the Women's Empowerment Principles, and they reached 100%, and it was the first multinational company who achieved this, so congratulations for that. And thank you to you. And here we are grateful to both our speakers for their insights. And from this point on, we have still 15 minutes, and we would like to give you all to you all the opportunity to interact and with our panelists. And please, we have been receiving some questions, actually a lot of questions, and I'm just choosing some of them to begin, but please feel free to contact us if you have additional questions. And if there is anything we cannot be able to answer now, we are noting them and we will be sending you back with a detailed information. So there is a similar question that is coming up constantly, both for Rohini and Rob. And so my first question is a combined question for Rob. And there are several questions asked. How to get men engaged in push for gender equality? Not related.
Sorry, Meral, after Rob answers, maybe I can also share something.
Beautifully, love to. And how important is to get senior leaders engaged in driving gender equality, and what do they need to do? And this is a question and ask for Rob specifically. And for Sodexo, of course, it's a private sector company, so our audience is very interested about how they achieve this success. So what are the challenges Sodexo faced implementing diversity and inclusion and gender equality? But also, what are your main factors that have driven your success? Rob, over to you. And Rohini, please feel free to jump in, to complement.
Okay, okay.
Right, I'm just checking I'm unmuted. Can you hear me okay now?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep, super, great, okay, super. So thanks, Meral, and thanks for the question. And I mean, it's one that I have been very passionately engaged in, as I mentioned earlier, because I think having set out that landscape where we've got 80% of men in executive positions, and obviously throughout the organization, a big proportion of men in people manager, line manager positions, etc., and a lot of very important roles. Getting them engaged is absolutely critical if we want to get change. I mean, I love Rohini's point that actually it's not just the top down, it's the bottom up, it's the middle out as well, and I fully agree with that. But I think one of the things that we've seen about getting men engaged is really basically to invite them into the discussion. I think what I saw certainly at Mercer, for example, and we've been looking at this, was how we run our women's groups, for example, and in some countries, what we've done, which I think has been quite successful, is open those groups up, to men, make it clear that they're invited into the discussion, and we want to know their views about what they're thinking about. And what's really interesting, I think, is having done that, what we realize is a lot of men, especially, dare I say it, younger men or millennial men coming into the workforce and younger men, they want a lot of the same things actually. They want work-life balance, they want to spend time with their family, they want to be able to work flexibly, and they just haven't really had an ability to voice that in some way, shape or form. So inviting them into the conversation, hearing what they want, I think can be a really powerful way of getting more allies, if you like, for the change, and for them to see actually, and for them to discuss that actually gender equality is a two-sided thing. It's enabling women to advance more in the world of work, but it's also enabling men to advance more in the world of the home, and to have the balance that actually so many men often crave but feel very uncomfortable talking about. So I think that's kind of one of the elements. I think another element is about really focusing on the business impact. I think certainly what we found is that it is a great way to get men engaged, just to say, well, look, okay, our business needs various things in order to succeed. So how can you see that gender equality and your part in gender equality can help us succeed? And again, what we find is if you invite men into that conversation, that they really get involved in it, and there are some good discussions and some personal commitments. And we ran a session at Mercer called Men Matter, where we got kind of 60 men in a room talking about what it's like from a man's perspective to be in the world of work. And these insights came out, and these commitments came out to make some changes about how they did things. And and that's really great to see, because unless we see behaviour change, we're not going to see we're not see progress. And of course, the other thing that was really important was the data. Whether that's just something about how the male brain works, I don't really know. But I mean, certainly it's been important to show the data. So what do things really look like? What proportion have we got of women at different levels in the organisation? And I'm fine when I speak to kind of men's groups that I talk to in various different stages and times, talking with them about the data, what it's like in their organisation, how they can achieve business impact, but how they can also end up in a way that connects them not just with the workplace, but with the home and their family as well. Has been a great way, I think, to get men engaged. And one final shout out, I think, to our PWN colleagues in Istanbul in particular. They ran a program to get senior leaders engaged. And one of the things that they did very successfully was to raise the question for those senior leaders that had daughters, for example, what kind of world do they want their daughters to go into? How could they play a part in making the world a better place for their daughters, actually, and for their sons? And there are a variety of different ways to get senior leaders engaged, I think. But what's clear is, unless we get the senior leaders engaged, we don't get the change, because they drive so much. We need everybody. We need the top down, we need the middle out, and we need the bottom up, but we definitely need the leaders to get things moving, to get that engagement. And I think we ask them to commit. We ask them to walk the talk. And so we ask, for example, at Mercer, that our senior leaders are part of our Diversity and Inclusion Council, that they play a very active and very visible role in driving this change. So they're not just talking about it, they're actually doing it as well. So Rohini, I think you wanted to add some points to that.
Yeah, so I will, I'll sort of roll up the questions that were asked of me around sort of challenges and successes along with this getting men engaged. And I would agree that I think, leadership engagement is absolutely critical to the success of any of these initiatives. And the challenge often is to get them there. There are several business priorities. There are things happening at a very fast pace. Individuals, there's sort of changes in leadership, and all of this makes it challenging. But I do think that it's absolutely critical to engage men. As I mentioned in our So Together governance, the advisory board, we have men and women. Men continue to be key decision makers and influencers within the organization. So I would say there are three key things that we have done. The first is sort of raising awareness. People don't know what they don't know, providing them with opportunities to learn, to interact, to grow. Rob mentioned inviting them into the conversation, but also giving them those opportunities where they can see different perspectives is absolutely critical, whether it's through mentoring or sponsorship, or whether it's through trainings, whatever that might be. The second would be, I think the business case is still critical, because it is about, for us, it was about the impact on the business. So the reason we did this business case, Sodexo business case, was because we wanted to share the data and the impact it had on the business and productivity and financial outcomes. But it was also about demonstrating to male leaders that if we are leaders in this space, in diversity and inclusion, it can help to really build our brand and can be a differentiator and a competitive advantage in getting more business. So making that connection was very critical. So it's about, the awareness, the education, it's about the head and the data and the business case, but ultimately it also has to be about the heart. And you really have to meet people where they are and give them, understand the what's in it for them. So very quick story that I'll share with you. When we started this work in Europe, there was a leader in Europe who actually headed up all of our European business, who really was, on the sidelines. He was not particularly bought into the importance of diversity and inclusion. I knew that for him, it was very important to engage with other CEOs as a business development opportunity. So I got him involved in a cross-company mentoring program in the UK at the time. And he ended up mentoring a woman from a different company who got laid off. And so he came to me after that, and of course he was very close to her. He heard her perspective, etc. And he was, because he was her mentor, he came to me after that and he said, I cannot believe that women go through these experiences in organizations. I don't want that to happen in my organization. Now, I could have told him this till I was blue in the face, but he was not ready to hear. It was this experience. Could someone mute their line so there's disturbance? There was this experience in terms of him sort of, understanding what was in it for him from a business perspective, connecting him to this mentoring program. So he said to me, he said, I want all of my 12 direct reports to mentor a woman in Europe. So they were all European country heads, and each of them mentored a woman from a different country. And I will say that of those 12, 10 of those women are in very senior leadership positions, either heading up significant portfolios of business or country heads, because it was just a question of making these women visible, getting them a sponsor. And it also had an impact because it was a reciprocal mentoring program. It had an impact on the individual leader as well. So this one leader came to me and said, if you had asked me to select a candidate, to manage a high security facility, and if there was a man and a woman, I would have selected the man, because it takes an assertive style, it takes strength, it's a dangerous environment. And he said, after mentoring this woman who actually she's the leader of these high security facilities, I will never let that unconscious bias come into play, because she's effective. She has a different leadership style, but she's very effective. So it's those kinds of, meeting people where they are, giving them the opportunities to have that epiphany, combined with the education and awareness, combined with the data and the business case, that really helps to get leaders on board. So that was a challenge. And I think one of the biggest successes is that our efforts are really driven by our leadership at the top. Back to you, Meral.
Thank you very much, Rohini. Unfortunately, we have only a few minutes for questions. But here a question I think it's very important for all of us to understand. And how did you persuade the executive board and C-level folks? I mean, the question here at Sodexo, but I am asking both to Mercer, because Mercer also is a company, to champion gender diversity specifically. How did you overcome the resistance and the unconscious bias from executive leaders? This question was from Alicia Faust. And to complete this, what is the gender split on Gender Strategy Advisory Board? From Terry Mellish. And Robert and Rohini, and please feel free to answer.
So I think I sort of responded to this question, in my earlier response. I'm not going to go through it. So it honestly was, the way we phased it was education and awareness, the business angle, so the data, but then also bringing in our client organizations, because hearing from clients makes a big difference. I mean, if clients are important, similarly, hearing from customers makes a big difference. So you have to figure out, be strategic in how you influence. And then the last piece was really meeting each person where they were, understanding what makes them tick, and then providing them with that opportunity so they could get that epiphany. And I mentioned in this case of the one leader, it was sponsoring or mentoring this woman who gave him a different perspective that led him to ask for his entire team to have reciprocal mentoring, which led to some more epiphanies. And so I think it's that sort of continuum, if you will, that is really important. And the gender split in the So Together governance body, I mentioned we started with the advisory board. We started with all women. So over time, we've taken on more men. Our target is to get to 40%, but because it's also about making women visible to the organization, we don't want to go in that direction too fast. So right now we have 25% men. It will be increasing to about 30% in another couple of months. But we don't want to dilute the other purpose, which is taking high potential women, making them visible to the organization. Whereas the objective that the men have is to really be ambassadors and champions to engage their spheres of influence. So that's the other way we brought leadership on board. So for instance, the leader in India, he's part of this, and he has cascaded those targets to his entire executive team. He says, he has targets for them linked to incentives. It's on their performance plan. He drives gender balance in a country and a culture which is very, very challenging, and has achieved some tremendous successes, both in terms of the brand of Sodexo, which is recognized for this work, but also in terms of hard numbers. So
thanks, Rohini. And just quickly to add from the Mercer perspective, I think the thing that's really driven our senior leadership to focus on this, is the way that we need to serve our customers and what our customers look like and what our customers are looking for from us. And it's very clear that our clients are getting increasingly diverse. So if we have a workforce that's not diverse, it really makes challenges for us in terms of, you know, working with them, partnering with them, for example, in solving these great challenges of the workforce of the future. But it's also about our talent. You know, we can't serve our customers without our talent. And, you know, we need to get access to the very best ideas as a consulting firm. So I think there's been very clear recognition that the best ideas, you know, come from a diverse talent pool, and that in order to have a diverse talent pool in the organization, we need to be inclusive. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got our executive team really basically being our diversity and inclusion council. There's roughly a 50-50 split on that group, and they have gone through, you know, unconscious bias training. I mean, that's been a very important part, I think, for all of us, but not just the training on a one-off basis, but it's reinforced as well. You know, that basically we're continually thinking, you know, how do I check myself? Are there any biases? Are there any assumptions? Are there any stereotypes that I'm making? And, you know, I have to give a shout out, for example, to Pat Milligan, who launched our When Women Thrive analysis 5 years ago. That's been enormously critical in helping us have a focus on gender equality at Mercer and pushing for the gender equality equation, you know, in organizations. It's been featured in Davos in the last 5 years. It's one of the most well-attended sessions that we have. So we're really trying to do our bit to promote the profile and raise the profile of gender equality, because we know that it's going to take that kind of joint effort of us, our clients, companies like Sodexo, to really bring this faster change we want to see in the world to getting towards a more gender equal planet and a more gender equal workplace.
Thank you very much, Rob. And unfortunately, it is already 11 o'clock in New York. And on behalf of We Empower team, I want to thank to all participants and all the panelists for joining the webinar. And if you would like to have more information on the topic of today's webinar or on the We Empower program, please contact us on we.empower@unwomen.org. And here we want to invite you to take a poll. And so because your opinion is very important for us, and we want to benefit from your feedback and improve our future webinars. And so you will see only some options, and please select the one that is more closer to your heart, that fits best to your thinking. So for the question, after the webinar, how informed are you with policies on diversity and inclusion? We had 40% of the respondents, they said they were informed, 29% somehow informed, 31% well informed. And thank you very much. We will certainly take this in consideration. And the second one, after the webinar, how informed are you with policies on diversity and inclusion? Second
Meral,
question.
it says it's a different question on the screen.
Yeah, the second question. Overall, how satisfied are you with the information received? Very satisfied, somehow satisfied, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, somehow dissatisfied, more information is needed. Overall, 52% of our respondents answered very satisfied, 34% somehow satisfied, 8% neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, and 6% needed more information. So we will really appreciate to have your feedback, written feedback, and to improve ourselves, but also this will help us for the organization of our next webinars, which we are planning to have every month. Thank you very much and for voting. And thank you very much also for participating to all our great speakers and the audience, and looking forward to reconvening for the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.